Oregon Territory, spring of 1869. The settlement sat like a smudge of dust against the endless horizon, a cluster of weathered shacks and wagon crates lashed together by necessity more than design. The air carried the heavy scent of sawdust and dry pine, laced with the tang of horse sweat and the bitter smoke of cheap tobacco. Around the makeshift auction stage, just a few warped planks nailed to stacked freight boxes, a knot of men stood shoulder to shoulder. Boots scuffed at the dirt, spurs clinked, and the low murmur of voices rose and fell like the restless shifting of cattle before a storm. The auctioneer was a deputy by badge alone, his faded blue vest stretched over a frame gone soft from whiskey. He slammed a wooden gavel against the post, the crack sharp enough to still the closest conversations. "Last one for the day," he barked. "She's got no name, ain't shown her face since Missouri, says she can work, says she'll obey. Starting bid, $2. Who's brave or drunk enough to marry the mystery?" Laughter broke from the crowd, jagged and mean. "Maybe she's a witch," someone called. "Maybe she's dead under that sack," another jeered. A few men spat into the dust and turned away. Others stayed, their eyes glinting with the sort of curiosity that had nothing to do with kindness. On the platform, the woman stood barefoot and still, her hands bound loosely with frayed twine. The burlap sack over her head hung low, stained from travel, tied tight at the neck. She did not fidget or plead, but her shallow, measured breathing betrayed the effort it took to keep her composure. The auctioneer's tone soured. "She's no good to anyone if she won't even speak." The silence stretched, until the crowd parted without a word. From the back came a tall man in a canvas coat, his boots caked in mud, the leather-wrapped handle of an axe resting over one shoulder. Silas Boone, a lumberman who had lived more years with the company of trees than of men. His face was shadowed by the brim of a black hat, his eyes calm, unreadable. $2, he said. The auctioneer squinted. "You sure, mister?" I said what I said. His voice was low, steady, not eager, not hesitant, but certain enough to quiet the last of the laughter. The deputy turned auctioneer swallowed, then scrawled the record. "Name for the court, sir?" "Silas Boone, Northridge." The paper changed hands. The auctioneer turned to the woman. "You're now legally wed, miss. Say your name for the record." The sack shifted. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of wind through the pines. Then came a voice, soft but clear enough to carry. Annabelle Crow. Silas froze. Not from doubt, but from recognition. If you love tales of grit, redemption, and love that lasts, subscribe now and ride with us to the very end. The trail that wound away from the outpost narrowed quickly, hemmed in by stands of tall pine and fir that swayed in the late afternoon breeze. The sound of the auction faded behind them, replaced by the steady thud of boots on packed earth and the soft creak of the mule's harness. Silas walked ahead, one hand on the reins of the animal that carried their meager supplies, a bedroll, a sack of flour, and a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Annabelle followed without a word, the burlap still tied over her head, her steps quiet but sure. The silence between them was not strained. It was the kind of silence forged by people who had learned long ago that words were not always a currency worth spending. The forest pressed in on both sides, shadows stretching long across the trail as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Every so often, Silas glanced toward the tree line, as though listening for something more than the wind, an old habit from years of working alone in places where bears and storms gave no warning. By the time they reached the clearing, dusk had begun to settle. Silas's cabin stood at the far edge, its dark pine walls set snug against a low rise of earth that broke the north wind. A stone chimney climbed one side, and a rusted horseshoe hung above the door, nailed there so long ago its edges had sunk into the wood. The place was not large, one room, a loft above, but it was solid, tight against weather, and clean in the way of someone who lived alone and liked it that way. Silas pushed the door open, then stepped aside. "You pick where you stand," he said quietly. "No one's going to place you anymore." Annabelle stepped inside slowly. Her movements were cautious, deliberate, as though each step might be a test. She did not remove the sack. She crossed to the far wall and crouched there, her back to the room, hands resting loosely on her knees. Silas said nothing. He set a bundle of firewood by the stove, crouched to coax a flame into the tinder, and began preparing supper. The smells came first. The salt of smoked meat, the warm spice of cinnamon bark, and something earthy boiled down from roots and beans. He worked without fuss, moving with the rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. When the meal was ready, he filled 2 wooden bowls and set one on the table. The other he carried to a low stool near where Annabelle sat. She flinched slightly when it was placed within reach, but did not turn her head. "I call it the meal for the last one standing," he said. There was a pause, then a sound so small it might have been the start of a laugh, caught before it could escape. Silas glanced at her but kept his tone easy. "Used to make it for myself after long days in the woods. Then I started making 2 bowls, even when there wasn't anyone to eat the second." He gestured toward the table where the other bowl sat steaming beside an empty chair. "I set it for my wife after the war, after the trees took more than they gave. Just a way to say I made it home alive again." Annabelle's head tilted slightly toward him. Her hands moved, slow but certain, lifting the bowl from the stool. She drew the spoon under the edge of the sack and took a careful bite. Another. Her posture stayed guarded, but she finished every drop. It was not conversation, and it was not surrender. But in the quiet that followed, with the fire casting a warm glow over rough-hewn walls, something small shifted. It was the first spark of trust, fragile as a pine needle in the wind, but there all the same. The first light of morning came pale and slow, filtering through the pines in narrow golden shafts. Mist still clung low along the forest floor, curling around roots and fallen branches like it was reluctant to lift. Annabelle stepped out of the cabin alone, her arms folded across her middle as she crossed the small yard to the edge of the clearing. The burlap sack still covered her head, but her steps no longer wavered. At the base of a tall pine that stood like a sentinel over the clearing, she stopped. For a moment she was utterly still, listening to the faint rustle of needles high above and the far-off trill of a jay. Then her hands lifted to the knot at the back of her neck. The rope loosened, the fabric sliding upward until her mouth and nose felt the cool breath of the morning. She closed her eyes and let the wind touch her face, a sliver of bare skin catching the sun. It was not defiance. It was the smallest beginning. From the side yard, Silas knelt beside a wooden basin, running an oiled rag along the teeth of his cross-cut saw. He didn't rise or call out when he saw her, just watched for a moment before speaking in the even tone he used when telling a story meant for the trees as much as for people. "I once got hurt bad. Deep winter," he said. "Got turned around near Black Ridge. Should have died out there." His hands kept moving over the steel. "Someone found me, pulled me into a cave, built a fire. She wore a sack over her head, wouldn't say her name, barely let me see her hands. But I remember her voice." Annabelle did not turn. Her fingers brushed the edge of the sack where it bunched at her chin. "Your voice," he continued, "sounds just like hers." The fabric whispered as it slid over her hair and down her back. She stood holding it in both hands, the morning light spilling across her face. It was not monstrous, not deformed, but a long, curved scar ran from her right temple to just above her jawline, pale against her skin but deep enough to speak of violence that had tried to take something from her and failed. She met his gaze for a breath before looking past him as if she had to keep her eyes on the memory she was about to set free. "The man who ran the boarding house where I worked, he told me I could keep a room if I gave him more than rent." Her voice was steady, but each word felt measured, weighed before it left her lips. "I said no. He didn't like that." Her hands tightened around the burlap. "He came at me. I fought back, pushed him. He slipped. His head hit the stove. He died." Silas's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. "They said I lured him, said I planned it. There were no witnesses who'd stand for me. They called me a liar, a temptress, a killer." Her voice thinned at the edges, but she kept it from breaking. "They sold me to pay his debts, passed me along like cattle, covered my face to make it easier, to make me nothing." Her eyes dropped to the sack in her hands. "I wore this so people wouldn't look at me like I was poison. so they wouldn't see the scar and decide what I was worth before I said a word. For a long moment, only the wind moved between them. Silas set the saw aside, wiping his hands on a cloth before standing. He didn't close the space between them, didn't reach for her. Instead, his voice was quiet but certain. "Thank you for telling me. You didn't have to, but you did." Her gaze lifted again, searching his face for judgment and finding none. She blinked once, hard, but no tears came. Only a long, steady breath. And in that breath, something shifted between them. For the first time since she'd stepped onto that auction platform, she was not a shadow, not a secret to be kept hidden. She was a woman with a name, a story, and a face. And Silas Boone had turned away from none of it. The next morning dawned clear, the mist lifting early as sunlight spilled through the narrow window above the cabin's table. Annabelle rose from her cot, her bare feet quiet against the smooth plank floor. She expected to see the same simple start to the day, the tin of coffee waiting to be boiled, the wooden bowl she had washed the night before, the spoon beside it. But as she approached the table, she stopped short. There, resting at the center, was a small mirror. Its frame was silver, worn to a soft patina at the corners, but the glass itself was clean and polished to clarity. It leaned against a wedge of pine, angled to catch the morning light so that it glowed rather than glared. Beside it lay a scarf, sea green silk, its edges faded in places but still soft and fluid, as though it had been kept carefully over many years. Annabelle stood motionless, her hands loose at her sides. The fire in the stove had gone low, and in the quiet she could hear the faint creak of beams above, the drip of dew falling from the eaves outside. Slowly she stepped forward until the mirror caught her reflection. She had felt her face 100 times in the dark, memorized every ridge and hollow of the scar that cut its arc from temple to jaw. She knew its shape as well as the lines of her own palm. But in the soft light through clean glass, it seemed less like a brand and more like a map, one that told of storms weathered and roads survived. Her hand lifted, brushing lightly over the mark. Then her gaze fell to the scarf. She picked it up, letting the fabric slide between her fingers, cool and smooth, a whisper of care stitched into every thread. Without looking away from her reflection, she draped it over her head, not to cover, but to frame. She adjusted it until it rested just so, softening the edge of the scar without erasing it, shaping what others would see but leaving the truth in plain view. She did not hear Silas enter until his shadow crossed the floorboards. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, watching her with a quiet reverence. "That used to be my wife's," he said, his voice steady. "She wore it whenever she needed to feel like herself again." Annabelle's fingers touched the scarf at her temple. She met his eyes in the mirror, not flinching, not searching for permission. "I thought maybe it would suit you too," he added. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Silas's voice came, low and certain. "Anyone who tries to make you ashamed of what you've lived through is blind, and the blind don't get to judge beauty." Something broke loose inside her, not sharply, but like ice softening under the first warmth of spring. The tears that rose were slow, unhurried, and they didn't sting. They carried no panic, no shame, only the strange relief of release. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Then, slowly, she turned from the mirror to face him fully, her hand still resting on the scarf. He didn't move toward her, didn't speak again, just held her gaze with the steadiness of someone who understood that the hardest part of trust was not in the telling, but in letting oneself be seen after. Annabelle took another step, closing part of the space between them. The cabin seemed to hold its breath with her, the air alive with something both fragile and unbreakable. And for the first time since she had left the pine in the clearing the day before, she did not think about the scar, or the sack, or the names they'd tried to pin on her. She thought only of the woman in the mirror, the one she had chosen to show. In that moment, she was no longer a fugitive from her own story. She was its keeper. And Silas Boone, without a single condition, had just made it clear he would stand in its light. In the days that followed, the sea green scarf became as much a part of Annabelle as the scar itself. She wore it in the yard while chopping vegetables, at the creek when rinsing laundry, even tucked beneath her chin on cold mornings. It didn't hide her. It framed her, like the careful edge of a picture that told the viewer exactly where to look. The sack that once served as her prison now sat folded in the bottom of a chest, untouched. But trouble, as the forest well knew, had a way of finding those who'd just begun to breathe freely. It came on horseback under a sky bruised with the threat of rain. The rider was tall and narrow, his duster coat torn by hard miles. He walked into the saloon in the nearest logging post and asked just enough questions to make men glance sideways. His name was Cutter, a bounty hunter with a reputation for finding what others wanted kept hidden. Word traveled faster than Cutter's horse. By the time Silas crossed paths with him near the supply shed, the man's eyes had already measured the lumbermen in that cold, reptile way, calculating distance, weight, advantage. He asked about a girl with a scar, said he'd heard she had blood on her hands. Silas didn't answer him there, but when he returned to the cabin, his voice carried the chill of the wind outside. "He's hunting you," he said simply. Annabelle looked up from the pot she was stirring. She didn't ask who. She didn't need to. After a long moment, she crossed to the chest at the foot of her bed and lifted the lid. Inside, the burlap lay where she had left it. She held it in her hands, staring at the rough weave. "I'll wear it again," she said quietly. "You don't have to." This time, she met his gaze. "I choose it, not for shame, for strategy." They laid out the plan by lamplight. Annabelle would ride east along the old fire road, the sack tight over her head, her posture bent just enough to look beaten. Cutter, they knew, wouldn't be able to resist the sight of a lone, marked woman. Silas would take the mountain pass and meet the sheriff in town. If they timed it right, Cutter would follow her straight into the trap. At dawn, Annabelle mounted Silas's second horse. The sack was in place, the scarf folded away in her saddlebag. Her heart beat hard, but her hands were steady on the reins. She rode without looking back. By sundown, the plan had sprung. Cutter took the bait, chasing her deep into the eastern rocks. When she reached the narrow pass, the sheriff and 2 ridge patrolmen stepped out from the trees. Cutter drew first, but not fast enough. In seconds, he was disarmed, bound, and thrown over the back of his own horse, charged with unlawful pursuit and intent to kill. From a rise above, Annabelle watched, her figure still shrouded in the sack. Only when Cutter's horse had vanished down the trail toward town did she ride down to meet Silas. He stepped forward, helping her down without a word. Slowly, she reached up and untied the knot at the base of her neck. The sack slipped free into her hands. She folded it once, twice, her eyes still on the fabric. "It saved me one last time," she said. "Not because it hid me, because I used it." Silas studied her face, the light of the setting sun touching the scar and the curve of her cheek in equal measure. "Then what will you do with it now?" She tucked the sack beneath her arm. "Keep it," she said softly. "Not as a cage, but as proof." "Proof of what?" Her smile was small but certain. "That even what was once my prison can become my shield, if I choose it to be." It was late afternoon when the knock came. 3 soft taps, spaced far enough apart to carry uncertainty. Silas looked up from sharpening his draw knife, the sound unusual enough to set both of them on edge. Annabelle wiped her hands on her apron and stepped toward the door, her movements slow, listening for any hint of danger. When Silas pulled it open, a woman stood on the porch. Her dress was worn from travel, the hem dusted with the red grit of miles, and her boots looked as though they'd been mended more than once. Her skin was the warm brown of walnut wood, her posture straight, her eyes cautious but not hard. She held her hat in both hands, twisting the brim as though it might steady her. "Name's Mavis," she said. Then, after a breath, "Mavis Green. I used to work at the Ridley House, kitchen help mostly." Behind Silas, Annabelle stepped into the doorway. She froze when she saw the woman, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Mavis took half a step back, then stopped herself. "I heard you were up this way," Mavis said, her voice quiet but clear. "And I figured it was time I stopped being a coward." The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke. Neither woman spoke at first, the silence thick with memory. "I saw what happened that night," Mavis said finally. "Saw him drag you into that back room. Heard you scream, heard the crash, but I didn't speak up." Her eyes dropped to the porch boards. "I needed the job, I needed to eat. I told myself it wasn't my place, but the truth is, I was afraid." Annabelle's fingers tightened around the edge of the doorframe. She said nothing, but her gaze never left Mavis's face. "I'm not proud of that," Mavis continued, "but I can make it right now if you'll let me." Later, they sat at the small table inside, steam rising from mugs of tea. The fire snapped in the stove, filling the room with the scent of pine resin and cinnamon bark. Mavis spoke steadily, recounting every detail of that night. The way the boarding house owner had cornered Annabelle, the threats he'd muttered, the scuffle, the sudden thud of his head hitting the stove. She described the bruise already forming on Annabelle's cheek, the cut on her hand, the shock in her eyes. "These are things no one could guess," Silas said quietly. Mavis nodded. "I should have said it back then, but I will say it now." With Silas's help, they wrote it all down in careful, deliberate script. Mavis signed the affidavit with a firm hand, her name curling at the end as though underlining her resolve. The letter was sealed and sent by horseback courier to the nearest judicial office, a 2-day ride over rough trail. Days slipped into weeks. The forest turned greener, the river louder with meltwater. Annabelle went about her chores as she always had, but her eyes often drifted toward the horizon when she thought no one was watching. Then, one morning, the sheriff rode up to the cabin. He swung down from his bay gelding, dusted off his coat, and pulled an envelope from inside. "Figured I'd best bring this myself," he said. Silas took the letter, his thumb brushing over the wax seal before he broke it. He read it once, then again, his expression shifting from guarded to something lighter. Without a word, he handed it to Annabelle. The message was brief. Charges against Annabelle Crow dropped, case closed, warrant rescinded. She read the words twice, her hands steady, her breathing even. Then she folded the letter and set it on the table, as though it might still be needed later. Without speaking, she stepped outside, past the stacked firewood in the corral down toward the tree line. She walked until she reached the tall pine at the edge of the clearing, the one beneath which she had once hidden the burlap sack. The ground here was soft with moss, the air cool with the shadow of the branches above. She lowered herself to sit at its base, pressing her palm into the earth. Her eyes closed, her face tilted toward the filtered sunlight. She did not cry. She did not laugh. When she spoke, her voice was barely more than breath. "For the first time in my life," she said, "I don't have to run." The forest seemed to hold the words, letting them settle like seeds into the soil. For once, they were hers to keep. Spring crept into the ridge without fanfare, softening the edges of winter one quiet day at a time. The trees along the clearing traded bare limbs for tender buds, and the morning mist, once thick and stubborn, now rose lighter and quicker, as if even the fog had grown tired of hiding. Birds returned to the branches with unhurried songs, and the air smelled faintly of thawed earth and new growth. Silas worked in the yard beneath the pale blue sky, his hands steady on the plane as he smoothed the last of the pine beams. With the same quiet care he gave to felling a tree or mending a roof, he built the arch, 4 upright posts, crosspieces fitted snug, draped with clean white linen that swayed in the gentle breeze. It wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. It stood solid like him, and it would stand as long as the wood lasted. Word of the gathering had been sent only to those who mattered. Mavis arrived first, her smile broad beneath a hat that didn't quite match her dress. The old blacksmith from town came with a bottle of apple brandy tucked under one arm. The shopkeeper's wife brought a basket of fresh bread and a bundle of mountain lavender, its scent bright and sharp in the air. They talked quietly among themselves, respectful of the space, as though they understood this day was built as much from silence as from words. Inside the cabin, Annabelle stood before the same small mirror Silas had set for her months ago. Her dress was plain muslin, hand-stitched in the long evenings of winter, the cream-colored fabric falling neatly to her ankles. It fit her perfectly because it had been made by her own hands, but it was the veil that drew her reflection's gaze. the veil she had sewn from the burlap sack that once hid her face from the world. Silas had washed it, let the sun dry it until the fibers softened, and cut it with care. Along its edges, she had embroidered tiny wildflowers in soft purples and greens, almost identical to those stitched into the handkerchief she had left behind in the snow years ago. The scar was still there, the story still written on her skin, but now the veil told the rest of it. How she had carried the weight, reshaped it, and chosen to wear it again, this time on her own terms. When she stepped outside, the forest seemed to pause. Silas stood beneath the arch, his boots polished, his beard trimmed, the clean white of his one sap-free shirt bright against the backdrop of pine. His eyes softened as she walked toward him, each step deliberate, the muslin dress swaying gently, the embroidered veil catching the light. It wasn't the veil that made her beautiful. It was the woman who had chosen it, who had remade it into something worthy of this moment. And as she reached him, the hush of the clearing carried the unspoken truth between them. Justice had come, freedom had taken root, and what lay ahead belonged to them both. They stood together beneath the linen-draped arch, no priest, no book, no formal order, just the two of them, the pine beams, and the few people whose presence mattered. The breeze tugged gently at the cloth overhead, carrying the scent of lavender from the shopkeeper's wife's bouquet. Mavis stood nearest, her hands clasped, a quiet pride in her eyes. The blacksmith shifted his weight, his bottle of apple brandy catching a glint of sunlight. Silas reached for Annabelle's hands. His grip was warm, steady, the kind of hold that told her there was no part of her story he would turn away from. "No matter what covered your face," he said, his voice deep and certain, "you were always the woman I chose from the start. And now, you're the woman I vow to stand beside until the end." Her answer came without hesitation. "And I vow the same. That whatever storms come, whatever shadows return, I'll meet them with you. And I'll keep choosing you, Silas Boone." There was no audience applause, no grand declaration to echo over the hills. Just the quiet, the trees standing witness, and the feeling that the vows had settled into the ground like roots. When Silas leaned forward and kissed her, it was not a rush or a claim. It was the meeting of two people who knew exactly what it had taken to arrive here. After the bread was shared, after the brandy was poured into tin cups, and after Mavis had pressed Annabelle's hands one last time, the guests drifted back to their own roads. Evening crept in soft and slow, brushing the tops of the pines with gold. On the porch, they sat side by side, the wooden boards warm beneath them from the day's sun. Annabelle's veil, her veil, lay folded across her lap, the embroidered wildflowers catching the fading light. She ran her fingers along the edge, her thumb tracing the stitches. "Funny," she said at last, her gaze still on the cloth. "This thing used to mean everything I feared." Silas glanced at her, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "And now?" Her lips curved into something between a smile and a sigh. "Now it means everything I chose." They sat that way, their shoulders just touching, watching the light soften in the clearing. The forest spread out around them, the same forest that had once closed in like a cage. But tonight it felt different, open, protective, almost welcoming. The walls of trees no longer kept her in, they kept the rest of the world at bay. The past was still there. It would always be there, like the scar on her cheek, like the rough weave of the burlap she had remade into silk in her own way, but the past was not a chain. It was a weight she could carry without bowing under it, because she had decided how to carry it. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. The wind moved through the high branches, and the scent of pine drifted over the porch. Silas reached across and laced his fingers through hers. And so, beneath the towering pines, in the heart of a place that had once been her prison, Annabelle Crow found her home. Not in forgetting what had been done to her, but in reclaiming it, in turning what was once meant to break her into something that could stand beside her. Their love didn't erase the pain, the scars, or the silence, but it transformed them into something that could last. If stories like this stir your soul, subscribe now to Dust and Destiny, share it with a friend, and tell us your thoughts in the comments.